Well, after analyzing the biblical story from this perspective, Reese shows that the acceptance of each individual, the subduer hunter, the servant thinker, the acceptance of each by the other is ultimately necessary for what he views as a final redemption, this redemption to be accomplished. Well, a very interesting literary observation if one approaches these opening chapters of Genesis as a whole, from a synchronic perspective that ultimately connects with the general understanding of the course of Near Eastern history. Well, what does this have to do then with the Book of Mormon? Well, it's fascinating to consider, but this same ancient Near Eastern mindset that has influenced the development of the story of Jacob and Esau, and even the much, much later observations of Arab philosopher Ibn Khaldun, really do stand at the heart of Book of Mormon narrative, where we have two separate, distinct groups of individuals, Lamanites versus Nephites, in constant threat and in constant conflict with one another, I should say. And the descriptions provided of these two individuals are very much in this traditional understanding of the distinct individuals who occupy the human existence from a Near Eastern perspective. You have the civilized Nephites, who, of course, are described as building temples like those, like at least a temple like the one Solomon had in the city of Jerusalem. Mosiah 9 verse 8, we read that the Nephites began to build buildings. Okay, an example of the cognate accusative, a traditional Hebraic formulation where the verb is the exact same word as the accusative in the sentence or the direct object. So we began to build buildings to repair the walls of the city, we read. Yea, even the walls of the city of Lehi Nephi, and so forth. So the Nephites are civilized, they are city dwellers, and they are, of course, therefore in constant conflict with those who dwell in the wilderness, their enemies, the Lamanites, who, just one chapter later, in Mosiah chapter 10, verse 12, if we turn the pages, we read that the Lamanites, in contrast to the sedentary lifestyle of the Nephites, we read the Lamanites were a wild and ferocious people. They were bloodthirsty, and so forth. Now, this is the portrayal or the contrast that is established throughout the entire Book of Mormon. We see it quite clearly in Enos, in verse 20. We read Enos's words regarding the distinction between Lamanites versus Nephites. He writes, "And I bear record that the people of Nephi did seek diligently to restore the Lamanites under the true faith in God." Notice, what is the hope of the Nephite people? It is a hope of restoration between the two groups, between Lamanites and Nephites. Okay, a restoration of the Lamanites under the true faith in God. But, he states, unfortunately our labors were vain, for their hatred was fixed, and they were led by their evil nature, and they became wild. See, they're nomadic, they're wild in contrast to the civilized state of the Nephites. Wild, ferocious, bloodthirsty people, full of idolatry and filthiness, he states, feeding upon beasts of prey, dwelling in tents, and wandering about in the wilderness. See, they're wanderers, they're nomadic. With a short skin girdle about their loins and their heads shaven, their skill was in the bow, and with the scimitar and the axe. And many of them did eat nothing save it was raw meat, which is, of course, true for nomadic people. They were continually seeking to destroy us, at least as nomadic people are portrayed and considered in Near Eastern traditions. So we have here what is set up in the Book of Mormon, the traditional Near Eastern distinction between nomad versus civilized society, and the fact that these two groups are constantly at odds with one another, and an ultimate reflection, again, if Moshe Reese is correct, with the archetypes of human existence, where we have the Adam figure in Genesis chapter 1, who is the hunter, the nomadic individual, the subduer, in contrast to the second human and version of creation in Genesis chapter 2 and forward, who dwells in Eden and is cultivating the land, working, the servant thinker, the more civilized of the two. Again, the article is fascinating because he notes that although both distinct groups, both individuals, have worthy qualities, these archetypes are essential for understanding the distinctions that exist between human existence from a Near Eastern perspective, but also shows that not only their distinction, but their ultimate unification is what is so essential for final redemption to be accomplished. Well, that's, of course, the hope and prayer of all of the Book of Mormon prophets, that there will be at some point a reunification between these two distinct groups, the civilized Nephites versus the Lamanites who are dwelling in the wilderness, who are bloodthirsty and brave and clearly nomadic. This is quite clear throughout the entire Book of Mormon, perhaps in no greater location than the Book of Mormon title page itself, where we read the words that it, meaning the Book of Mormon, is an abridgment of the record of the people of Nephi and also of the Lamanites, written to the Lamanites, who are a remnant of the house of Israel, and so forth. And it is specifically, as we read on, to show unto the remnant of the house of Israel, which specifically in this day are the Lamanites, what great things the Lord hath done for their fathers, that they may know the covenants of the Lord, that they are not cast off forever. So fascinating to consider the Book of Mormon in the context of this constant cycle of nomad, wanderer versus civilized city dweller. That is apparent not only in the stories, and not only throughout Near Eastern tradition, but and history, but also specifically in the patriarchal stories of the Bible. Obviously, clearly, with the story of Jacob, the tent dweller versus Esau, the hunter, and yet we see the same sort of distinction and thematic portrayal in the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, the Babylonian story of kingship, where the king of Uruk, King Gilgamesh, who is the city dweller, ends up, at least initially in the myth, in conflict with Enkidu, the wild man who lives out in the wilderness. And yet the unification that ultimately takes place between these brothers, these individuals, who creates a brotherhood of sorts, is essential then for the rest of the development of this ancient Near Eastern myth from Babylon. But even perhaps at a deeper level, between the two versions of creation that are compiled now in the current book of Genesis.